Hello and welcome to this webinar on using data to persuade, a guide to behavioral change. Thanks everyone for joining. I want to kick this off by using a quick analogy that we will probably all understand. We have a burger and we're going to try and persuade you to eat it. And we have two key data points available. If you eat the burger now, you're going to increase your weight by 0.15 pounds by next Tuesday, a specific date. And we're going to increase the risk of heart attack. Now, for some people, this is enough persuasion to change their behavior. However, if we want to maximize the potential to persuade someone to change their behavior, there are 4 criteria we need to satisfy. The information needs to be relevant. So we're not getting flight information and flight data because that's not the activity that we're currently doing. We have a burger and we're going to eat it, so that has an impact on our health and nutrition. So that's the information we're getting. It is relevant to the action that we're currently doing. The information we're receiving is timely. So we're receiving it ideally just before we eat the burger, even better before we make the purchasing decision to buy the burger. We're not receiving it 3 months later, where it might be interesting, but it doesn't allow us to change our behavior. The information is personal, so to ensure that we're being persuasive, we have to use personal information. It's foundational to changing people's behavior with data. So imagine this was information that's an average for 1,000 people. If they eat the burger, this is the average outcome they're going to have. Then people are going to be less likely to be persuaded. Oh, well, look, it's only 0.15 pounds weight gain. There's probably lots of people, who had 10 bags of French fries a few hours before, and they can come up with excuses and reasons why they cannot be persuaded. So we need to make sure we're focused on specific users and specific personas, which we'll talk about in more detail. And finally, and most importantly, the information needs to be actionable. It's hard to persuade someone to change their behavior if we don't have some sort of defined action that we're driving towards. What's the outcome? What are we trying to do? Ultimately, what's the goal? So with these 4 criteria, we're going to maximize the success of persuading someone to change their behavior. And that sets the tone for what we're going to be talking about in the webinar today. A little bit about myself. I am Nicholas Kelly. I am the Director for Visual Analytics here at Logic 2020. And why do I talk about this? Because it is a topic that is of great importance in BI and reporting and analytics. Currently, it is a very hot topic. How do we get people to change their behavior? Through persuasion. I have conducted over 300 workshops with many of the largest firms in the world, and have created a number of tools and processes that facilitate that. So if we look at some of the processes that we have created here at Logic, we've got the enterprise dashboard process, which we're going to be looking at in some detail, and some of the tools that we use as well, the dashboard wireframe kit. I also speak on these topics: dashboard adoption, BI portals, and reporting best practices. Travel the world talking on these topics, and I am sitting with you now on this webinar from the offices of Logic 2020, which many of you will already know. What you may not know is that we're building a rapidly growing visualization capability that is built on our foundations of data science and all the ETL work that we do, which we have a comprehensive background in. But you'll see us growing and extending our reach in visualization and visual analytics, just because it is such a high value to our clients. So, what is persuasion? It is the action of persuading someone to do or believe something. So what does that mean? Ultimately, we're trying to achieve some sort of behavioral change. We might know we're trying to do that, but we need to understand what's the end goal we're trying to achieve before we're going to have success in persuading someone. there's 3 ways we're going to do that. So persuasion with data is rooted in people, it is facilitated by process, and it leverages technology. You'll notice there's 3 different font sizes here. And this is to show the importance of each of these pillars. So people is the most important by far. We're trying to persuade people. We're not trying to persuade process or technology. Those are going to be 2 of the mechanisms that we use to ensure persuasion of people. Process would be the vehicle through which we're going to build trust with the people we're trying to persuade, and ultimately technology will play a role, but it is a tertiary role. It's an important role, but if we're not using proper process and we're not understanding the people properly, it's going to be very, very hard to leverage technology to do much of anything. So we have to start with understanding the people. Who are the cast of characters that are involved, and ultimately who are we trying to persuade? So in any undertaking in reporting, BI, analytics, working with data, we tend to have this cast of characters, and you may find there's some roles missing, or there's some roles that you don't use that are here. The intent is to understand your own landscape, and it may be a little bit different to this. These are roles that you see represented here. They may not be individual people. So in any typical dashboard or report, you're going to have a business stakeholder. And that's going to be the person who's really sponsoring the dashboard and the effort. Usually the person who has the budget. There may or may not be an executive. They may be one and the same as the business stakeholder. They may be senior enough that they don't really care about this particular dashboard or report, but they have a wider goal that's being achieved or being served by that dashboard. We'll always have an end user. And when we talk about persuading people, this is really the people we're trying to persuade. However, everyone else in this group here plays a role in that persuasive story. We have the IT manager, which is a euphemism as well for anyone who's working with data. It's the person who owns the data and certainly should have an understanding of the permissions and the what tables and fields are available there. There may be a data scientist involved, there may not. There tends to be a consultant. I usually advocate for the person who is building or coming up with the requirements for the dashboard should be the consultant, should play that role. If you don't have your own consultant, you maybe consider putting on the consultant hat. It gives a different perspective. And then the analyst and ultimately the BI developer, the person who's doing the actual work. You may find there's plenty of overlap here. You might find the BI developer and analyst and consultant are one and the same person. But we have to start here in understanding who are the people that we're serving. And to do that, we use personas. So we have to understand the people's goals that we're trying to serve. We need to know what the levers are for persuading people. And we need to align with their goals in order to ensure greater success. So imagine in this example here, we've got a couple of personas that we've created. And this is one of the key steps that we use in understanding how to persuade. We first have to understand who's eating the burger. So what are the levers that we're going to use, right? So they have their own professional background and their own goals and challenges. If we're going to be successful in persuading people, we need to know what's making them tick. We need to know what's going on in their minds in their day that we can align with in order to help them in their goals and help them in their job. If we're trying to persuade people to do things that are not in alignment with their own goals and are not in their own best interests, it's going to be very hard to drive that kind of change and adoption that we're looking for. Ultimately, we're not going to succeed in persuading people to do much of anything. So in these examples here, you can see Michael Knight, who is a fictional persona, has some fairly basic goals, wants some accurate numbers, wants to improve data quality, wants to use some simple terms, has basic challenges, so doesn't know the state of the business, reports are highly staff dependent, and has some typical metrics that Michael looks at. All really important to understand that if we don't have this perspective, it'll be very hard to put ourselves in the shoes of this person and understand how we're going to be able to persuade them at all. So to do that, we use process. We use process as the vehicle to gain trust and drive change. So the traditional process would be to build a dashboard and put it in front of Michael and hope and pray that Michael will be persuaded by the data that's being presented. And it is a traditional approach, though it is not a very successful approach. To do this successfully, you need to have a number of touch points with your user, the person or people that you're trying to persuade. And you can see here in this process, there's three primary areas. We have the orange area at the top, which is requirements gathering, but it's also a means of engaging with some of the users and stakeholders early on in the process of creating the dashboard. You can see in the middle row here, we have the light blue, and this is where we come up with the vision. So we've understood what the requirements are, but now we need to envision it so we can start to get some sort of feedback before we get to the dark blue stage down the bottom row, which is the build and adoption. Before we do any building, we have to come up with the vision beforehand, right? So who are we trying to persuade? What are we going to persuade them with? And then ultimately, how are we going to drive that persuasion and change throughout the organization? So I'll step through some of the more important steps in this process. We start with interviewing stakeholders, and ultimately what we're trying to do is understand what are the goals? What are we trying to do? What are we driving towards? Remember, the stakeholders are the people who tend to have the idea, okay, we need a dashboard, here's a budget, let's go build a dashboard, right? And there's some goal and vision in there, right? That's in mind. This is a deliberate step to understand what's that vision, what are the goals, what are you seeking to achieve as a stakeholder? And this is very distinct to the user. The user is the people we're trying to persuade. We're trying to change the user's behavior with data. So to do that, we first interview the stakeholders, and then we go have some interviews with the users. Ultimately, we want to know how we can help the users achieve their goals in their own role. Quite often what we'll find is they don't even know their own goals. They may just be, dealing with the everyday fires of their jobs, and when you sit down with the user and ask them, well, tell me about your goals, what's going on in your day job, and how can data help you? It may be challenging to come up with those for some people. But we want to take that deliberate step to understand what are the levers that we can align with that are going to help us persuade them. Now, one of the first stumbling blocks you're going to come across here is there may well be a disconnect between the goals of the user and the goals of the stakeholder. And this tends to be one of the largest reasons why dashboards and reportings fail, is because of this disconnect. It will not achieve lasting adoption of the dashboard. So this is the first opportunity where we can do a little bit of iteration and understand, okay, how can we get these users in alignment with the stakeholders? And I'll give an example here of imagine an organization, you've got your own HR department, and you might have a chief HR officer, and you might have a bunch of HR managers. And the chief HR officer wants to bring down the cost of attrition. Let's say the average cost of attrition is 150,000, and annually it's, say, 10 million. And the chief HR officer, as the stakeholder, decides, okay, we need a dashboard. I need my HR managers looking at data, and I need to persuade them to start bringing down the cost of attrition. So build a dashboard. It's a well-designed dashboard, and it makes it very easy to drive down the cost of attrition. However, the HR managers, as the users of the dashboard, don't all get persuaded. The reason being is they have their own incentives. They have a Christmas bonus, and when Christmas comes along, their bonus is measured on how many people they can onboard every year. And that doesn't particularly align with the goals of the chief HR officer. So the users, the HR managers are looking at quantity, the chief HR officer is looking at quality. And so there's a disconnect there. So we might find that some HR managers are going to be persuaded because, well, my boss is basically telling me I need to do this. Whereas we're going to find some other folks, when Christmas comes and their bonuses are much smaller, that they'll go back to their old behavior, and that they haven't been persuaded long term. They might have been persuaded short term, but not long term. So this is going to be one of those very key steps that we have to understand in how we're going to have lasting persuasion of these users, that they're going to exhibit the behavior that we want them to exhibit longer term. After doing these interviews, we consolidate all of this information into personas. And again, using that example, a persona is someone who has similar roles and goals. So let's say we have 10 HR managers. It's pretty much going to be one persona, because all those HR managers should have common goals in their roles. However, if you have like a finance manager, that's probably going to be a completely separate persona. So going back to that example of the burger, we have to make it personal enough, and to do that, we have to design for personas. So that's the purpose of this step. Personas can also help us identify differences between users and the stakeholders' goals. Following that, we start to get onto the magic, which is forming everything in questions, framing everything in a natural language. So if you're a user and you need to start thinking about data, and we've got our IT people involved, we've got data scientists involved, we've got very technical people involved, we've also got very business savvy people involved who are non-technical. We need everyone coming to the party and being able to understand what we're trying to do. So we frame everything in the form of questions. What questions does the user need to have answered? And this is going to be a key step in persuading them, because if they can understand the process, it's going to be much easier to build their trust. So an example question would be, what is the cost of attrition? Very simple question. We just start framing out what are the questions the user needs to have answered. And then we put these questions through what we term as the scenario mapping step. This helps us understand what actions are going to be the outcomes of each question. What are we going to do about it? Okay, so I want to understand, well, what is the cost of attrition? Okay, well, let's break that down a bit. What do you need to see to understand that in more detail? Well, I need to see who are the people at the highest risk of leaving the organization. Okay, so you get a list. What are you going to do about it? What action are you going to take? Okay, well, if there's people at very high risk of leaving the organization, here are the 2 actions I'll take. I may contact their supervisor and ask them to give them more PTO. I may also understand, is there a problem with their supervisor? And I might take some corrective action there. But there would be a set number of actions that would be defined that we'd end up taking. Now, the advantage of doing this now is we do the heavy lifting and understanding the user needs now rather than later, rather than doing that during development and spending precious development hours and cycles understanding that. We do it much earlier on the requirements gathering phase. Next up is grouping, where we start to form the tabs of the dashboard and group the questions by theme. And then we start to go through the next row here, which is the lighter blue, and understanding, okay, well, how are we going to envision this? What's this going to look like? And we start that with the data check. You'll notice this is the first time there's any mention of data, and that's for good reason. We want to start the process understanding what's valuable to the business. What's value? How are we going to start to get a return on investment in our data? So we engage the stakeholders and users first to understand, okay, what is valuable? And then we see what's available in the data. And the usual argument here is, well, why wouldn't you start with data first? And let's just answer the questions that we can, what that's available with the data. The reason we do business value first is because we have the stakeholders involved, and these are the people that should hopefully have the budget available. With that budget, we can now say, okay, we've defined what are the valuable questions you need to have answered, but the data quality is only there to answer 5 of the 20 questions you have. Would you make the necessary investments to be able to improve the data quality, or to do whatever is required with the data to get it so we can answer those 20 questions? And usually it's a process of an iterative process, where it might be, okay, well, we can answer 2 more questions if we invest 1 full-time employee over the next 2 to 3 months. And after that, maybe another 6 months, we can answer 5 more questions. And over the period of 2 years, it looks like we'll be able to answer them all. But we want to have that conversation here rather than in development, rather than put a dashboard in front of the users and the stakeholders see it and go, why are all of these 15 questions not answered? Because that's going to be a very difficult conversation to have, and it's going to be one that starts to make it more difficult to have those conversations because trust is being eroded. So we do that data check here, and we can also then prioritize the questions based on what's the data quality for answering those questions, how much time and effort is required, what's the business value for these questions, right? So we can help prioritize how we're going to iterate on each of these questions and build them into the dashboard over time. The next step in the process is to do a technology check. And that's just a quick sanity check. Can we build what's being asked here in the chosen technology? And that's right before we start coming up with the KPIs, the key performance indicators. What are the key metrics that we would need to see at the top of the dashboard that's going to give us a pulse of what's going on? The charts would then answer those questions, and those questions should be answered with the charts with the defined actions that we've come up from the scenario mapping step, right? So the clear path to action the user needs to take when they see something red or something orange, that we have already defined what it is that they need to do. So they're not thinking about it. They don't have to go through a deep thought process and figuring out, okay, what am I going to do when I see something red or orange? It's already defined. The heavy lifting has been already done. We then define what filters are going to be available, and then we wireframe it. We bring it all together in a wireframe, and we tend to use tools that are very fast at doing that. So it could be whiteboards, notepad, paper, sticky notes. We use the dashboard wireframe kit extensively, but we need to be quick, we need to be agile. Ideally, we're not building in the tool itself right now. We use the wireframe then to do an alignment check with the stakeholders and users. We do a quick sanity check. Are the wireframes aligned to your goals? The goals we defined at the start of this process. Does it make sense? This is where we can start to iterate a little bit. So the typical process where you would end up building something in the dashboard tool, Power BI, for example, and that's the first time the users and stakeholders will see something visual, and they may want to make changes there and potentially do some change requests. Whereas when you're doing it in the wireframing phase, it's much faster to make those changes. So we can present those back to the users and stakeholders and get that feedback, make those changes before we get into development. Now, once we do start development, we have a visual requirements document in the form of a wireframe and the personas and the questions and everything we've done in the scenario mapping. We have properly understood the why of the dashboard that's being built, which makes it so much easier to persuade the users. We've got all the levers that we need understood in how we're going to maximize the behavioral change in those users. Now, the next step is a step that most of us don't like doing, but it is building the training materials. And the traditional approach has been to build a training document that would have a number of screenshots of the dashboard and report and how to use it. And they can end up being quite wordy and quite long documents, and not a lot of people are going to read them, and obviously take a considerable amount of time to put together. So there are two primary training materials that we would always create that are fast and they're realistic to produce. The first one is training videos. Really short 10-15 second training videos that are context relevant. What that means is we went and defined a bunch of questions that we need to have answered earlier on in this process. And let's say it is, who are the top 10 people at risk of leaving the organization? Okay, that is a name of a video that will take 10 to 15 seconds to watch. And it's basically a video you going into the dashboard and showing how you would answer that in the dashboard. So it's very, very specific, and it is very focused on the users that we've designed for. Remember the burger and that word relevant. We are making the training materials relevant to the specific user that we're designing for. And we can do that because we've done all these prior steps. So it makes it very easy to do the training materials. The other type of training material we do is, say in your Power BI dashboard, you have a attrition tab. Then you would have an attrition training tab. And that would pretty much be a screenshot of the attrition tab with then text overlaid on the KPIs and the charts, explaining what they are, what are the calculations behind them, and then what is the action that is to be taken under certain conditions. Like say it goes orange, here are the actions you would take when this KPI goes orange. So it makes it very, very easy for the user to access those training materials. Ideally, there should be very little friction for the user to access and understand how they're going to answer the questions they need to on the dashboard. So the distance they have to travel is pretty much one click on the dashboard. They don't have to jump out into email. They don't have to go into SharePoint necessarily. And though it is also a good place to have your training materials, ideally it's all in the single dashboard itself. Short distance for the user to travel. Now, depending on the size and scope of the dashboard, number of users, you do a pilot. And let's say you have 100 users, the pilot might be 10 people. If you only have 5 users, it's probably not worthwhile doing a pilot. But as a way to test the training materials, it's also a way to test and ensure that there's the business value that we thought we would have at the wireframe stage, that we still have that at the development stage. However, since we have done all the prior steps, it's going to be much easier to not have to iterate a lot because we've done those iterations at the wireframing stage. The next step is potentially one of the most important steps. It's the launch. And it is where you're going to build more trust and more persuasive power with your users. And we use the approach called the product launch formula. It was created by Jeff Walker, and it is a online marketing approach to how you sell and market products. One thing you'll find that is somewhat transformational is if you treat a dashboard like a product, and then you think, how are you going to sell that? How are you going to persuade people to buy that product? How are you going to persuade the users to use that dashboard? It is somewhat of a paradigm shift in how you would go about launching a dashboard. And there are plenty of comprehensive processes out there for how you would do that. We use the product launch formula. Very, very effective way of building trust, getting social proof, even using scarcity and some of these other social techniques and mental triggers that help people make a buying decision. And it all revolves around building trust and having multiple touch points. So examples of these would be, before you release a dashboard, that you would maybe have some feedback from people that were in the pilot. Hey, this is Jane, love the dashboard, made my job easier, probably save around 2 hours a week, right? So we're getting some social proof. You could have some live trainings beforehand. You could do some webinars, a number of things you can do in the launch process that makes it much, much easier to persuade the end users. And then we have the final step before we start iterating on the dashboard for adoption. It generally tends to manifest itself in the form of some sort of SharePoint portal or other type of portal where it is easy for you to put your dashboards and permission them and have chat and feedback, ideally real-time chat, potentially using Teams, to get people interacting and to get the thoughts and comments and feedback that you would need to start your next iteration. And as a general rule of thumb, we tend to find iterating on a dashboard 3 to 6 months is a fairly safe cadence to have. Obviously, there's a lot of variation there, but it tends to be a general rule that we find we can use. 3 to 6 months is a good one to aim for. So that is the process you would use to do it, but there are some tools that you can facilitate, they'll help you facilitate that. And I mentioned the dashboard wireframe kit. Also use PowerPoint extensively. You'll see the image up here on the top left is basically a PowerPoint wireframe, just a bunch of template charts and filters and cards basically would use to quickly share, get feedback from people. If they see something they don't like, Everyone has PowerPoint. It's really, really easy to change and get people kind of going back and forth and collaborating, particularly if they can't collaborate in person. You also see that we tend to use cards quite a lot. You'll see the dashboard wireframe kit here in the larger picture, and the kind of canned charts that are available in Power BI, so you can really, really quickly understand what's visually available. So you're not necessarily talking about, hey, what can I or can I not show? The conversation is, well, what's valuable? What does the user need to see? Right? It just makes it easier. The question's less about technology, it's more about business value and how we're going to persuade people. Now that's all fine for one dashboard, but how do you start scaling persuasion in your own department or organization? It requires a cultural shift, and there's sort of 3 pillars to how you would do that. You obviously first need to start engaging the organization and understand, well, where are we at? Doing your own internal assessment, and then coming up with your own strategy, a insights design process to, okay, well, where do we want to be as an organization? So we sort of had a look at the, how are we going to persuade people in a sort of singular one dashboard? Okay, that's great. How do we scale that? So you come up with your own strategy for how you do that, but then you have to start supporting data exploration, right? So being able to make it easy for people to find dashboards specific to their role, and it helped them to be able to act on it. And ultimately then driving a data-driven culture. So the train and support that goes around that, building a communication platform, and really trying to shift the culture. It's very, very hard to do, and it requires a lot of focus on change management. So driving a data-driven culture, you need several tools. You can see here in this example, we've got some, training workflow, how we're going to change people, shifting the culture across the organization. Some of the key things you would need to do here is obviously building training materials, engaging the stakeholders, having a change agent network, communications approach, measuring the impact of change, and getting buy-in from leadership and alignment. It is quite comprehensive. And in support of that, there's obviously the piece that technology plays. And some of the questions we find that when you're interviewing users is understanding, well, what devices are you using? What platforms do you typically use? Are you on SharePoint, Power BI? Do you often use Teams? And these are important considerations in how people are going to consume the information. And what's the vehicle, the lens through which we're going to be able to persuade people. So that's the role of technology. And ultimately, what we're trying to do is work these 3 areas together. Effective persuasion with data is about bringing people, process, and technology together. We talked extensively there about the process there in the bottom right. But the process is only used and is only valuable when we really understand the people, the cast of characters that you see up here. And then that's all facilitated through the steps here through technology, right? So do you have a portal? Do you understand how the users are going to interact with the data? Are they using it on their cell phone? Right? How are we going to be most effective? Persuasion is not one thing. It is all of these things together that you need to have to be very effective. So with that, do we have any questions for the Q&A phase? Anyone want to ask anything? Okay, so I have a question here on how long does it usually take to do the interviews? Okay, so and there's a follow-up there. Okay, so some people don't have time to do interviews, and that is obviously a challenge, and everyone's got their day job. So what I tend to do is, if you're good at doing workshops and if you've facilitated a few before, instead of doing all the interviews, I tend to do workshop, and they usually take 4, potentially to 8 hours. But if you can get some of the users together, you absolutely must have some of the stakeholders in the room there together. It can be a very effective way of doing it. It can also be a very dangerous way of engaging users and stakeholders, because you could have personalities and some of the politics surface in a workshop. So it can be a risky proposition. So I'd only recommend doing that if you have some experience with it. The normal interview process tend to maybe take half an hour for interviewing stakeholders. Longer if I can get it, but usually tends to be around the half an hour mark. There was an example there recently where someone said she was asked to create a dashboard on a Wednesday, and it had to be delivered by Friday. So going through all of this process was a complete non-starter for her. But I did say, well, can you grab a coffee with the stakeholder? And she was like, well, yeah, I probably could. And that was a 5-minute conversation that transformed the approach she was going to take. The request had been to build a sales dashboard, and it was pretty vague. Just, tell us what, how the sales are. And she didn't even know who the stakeholder was. So it actually required a few emails back and forth with her own boss to understand who the stakeholder was. But when she reached out to the stakeholder saying, look, can I pick your brain over a coffee? Her stakeholder she was more than happy to have that conversation. And what it turned out was her stakeholder had conducted a marketing campaign a few weeks prior and wanted to see what the uplift was in sales. And that was then a very, very different dashboard that she was going to produce, because it was basically looking at one product, one customer segment, and it was way more focused than what she was going to build. So had she gone on and just built the dashboard by Friday, she would have disappointed the stakeholder and the users, and probably would have had to rework the dashboard. So just taking this little bit of time to engage with the stakeholders beforehand was a massive time saver. So you'll see that, yeah, it looks like a lot of effort to do all of this stuff, and it is, but the time you save longer term, and then the trust you build, and the persuasive power you have by doing this process is far greater than just quickly knocking out a dashboard, because it might satisfy people short term. It's definitely not a long-term solution. So hopefully that answered your question. Any other questions? Okay, get a question here about how do you usually get feedback? Do you do focus groups or not? Okay, well, I think it's kind of similar to the first question. I mean, if you don't have time in your day to do it, how do you gather that feedback? So if you have Teams, SharePoint, for example, you got some sort of portal set up, great way to get feedback. Very effective. Even some people who may be more introverted mightn't want to do a focus group. Focus groups are great if you have the time, but if you don't, and you find you have people that just don't show up to those sorts of events, then having a mechanism to gather, a platform that people are comfortable with already, on some sort of online or means of giving real-time chat, so you can get feedback specific to the dashboard. That tends to be where I focus my efforts on feedback. And you'll find as you iterate through this process, it becomes much, much easier. It's a heavy lift usually on the first iteration, but it gets much lighter to gather feedback from people over time. Okay, folks, thanks for your attention, and I hope you got some value out of that session. If you do want to reach out to us, you already have our contact details, but feel free to reach out to myself, Nicholas Kelly, nickk@logic2020.com. And any questions, or you want to learn more about some of our services, happy to have that conversation. Thank you for your time.